Shanghai fallen, the Chinese soldiers in Nanking began to prepare in earnest. The troops transformed the face of Nanking. They dug trenches in the streets, laid down underground telephone lines, and strung barbed wire over city intersections that began to resemble battlefields. The troops also fortified the city wall, installing machine gun redoubts along the ancient battlements. They shut all gates except 3, keeping narrow passageways open only for military transport. Gates were barricaded with sandbags 20 feet deep and reinforced with wood and angle iron. At least one of them was walled up entirely with concrete. The military also resolved to clear by fire a mile-wide battle zone around the entire circumference of the city walls. Along the outskirts of the city, the inferno consumed barracks, agricultural research labs, a police training school, and pristine mansions. In the countryside, soldiers torched straw huts, farmhouses with thatched roofs, trees, bamboo groves, and underbrush. Not even major Nanking suburbs were spared. Troops herded residents from these districts into the city walls before incinerating their neighborhoods. People whose houses had been targeted for destructions were told to move out within hours or risk being arrested as spies. The military justified the burning as a strategic move, one to eliminate any structure of potential use to the invader. It is speculated that the fire was really an outlet for rage and frustration, a desire to leave the Japanese with little more than scorched earth. As the soldiers continued to prepare for invasion, anyone left with the strength, the judgment, the money, or the opportunity to leave, left. The city's population was down to around 500,000 people, half of its original size. Many of those left were refugees from the surrounding countryside, who left their homes in the hopes of safety behind the city walls. On December 8th, Chiang Kai-shek, his wife, and his advisors fled the city by plane. There was no longer any doubt. The Japanese siege of Nanking was about to begin. On December 9th, Japanese airplanes began dropping leaflets near Nanking. The best way to protect innocent civilians and cultural relics in the city, the message read, was to capitulate. The message promised that the Japanese would be harsh and relentless to those who resist, but kind and generous to non-combatants and to Chinese troops who entertained no enmity to Japan. It demanded that the city surrender within 24 hours, and by noon the next day, otherwise all the horrors of war will be let loose. Publicly, Tang expressed outrage at the terms of the ultimatum. Throwing the leaflet to the ground, he dictated an order that was distributed among the troops. "Our army must fight to defend every inch of the front line," the order read. "If anyone does not follow this order and retreats, he will be punished severely." The next few days saw intense fighting between the Chinese and Japanese troops around Nanking. The Japanese dropped bombs on the city and pounded the walls with heavy artillery fire. The situation became dire within just a few short days. The Japanese had broken through the Chinese defenses multiple times. Nanking was on the brink of collapse. Tang begged for support from Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang responded with orders informing Tang to begin a massive retreat. Tang expressed shock. His troops were at the moment engaged in furious fighting. An orderly retreat was not even a possibility. It would readily turn into a rout. "I can't worry about that," was the response. "You have to retreat by tonight." Unable to hold the line and under pressure, Tang complied. That afternoon, Tang gathered his commanders for a meeting. The Japanese, Tang told his generals, had already broken through the gates of the city and penetrated the wall in 3 places. "Do you still have any confidence to hold the defense line?" he asked the group. Although he waited several minutes for a response, the room remained silent. With slumped shoulders, Tang distributed the orders for a fighting retreat across the Yangtze. Not surprisingly, the order to retreat threw the Chinese military into an uproar. Some officers ran about the city, haphazardly informing anyone they came into contact with to pull out. Other officers told no one, not even their own troops, instead saving their own hides. Their soldiers continued to fight the Japanese, thinking they were witnessing a mass desertion when they saw other troops fleeing. They machine gunned down hundreds of fleeing comrades in an effort to stop them. In the haste and confusion to leave the city, at least one Chinese tank rolled over many Chinese soldiers in its path, stopping only when blown up by a hand grenade. Even in the larger tragic scheme of things, the retreat had its comic moments. As soldiers grew desperate to blend into the populace and thereby elude capture, they broke into shops to steal civilian clothes and undressed in the open. The streets soon filled not only with half-naked soldiers, but with half-naked police officers who had discarded their uniforms to avoid being mistaken as soldiers. In the early stages of the retreat, when a semblance of order remained, entire sections of Chinese army were shedding their uniforms, changing into civilian clothes, and marching in formation simultaneously. But when the retreat turned into a rout, the scramble for clothes grew urgent. Soldiers were actually seen throwing themselves on pedestrians and ripping the clothes off their backs. By the time the Japanese passed through the gates of the city, all those residents who possessed any degree of money, power, or foresight had already left for parts unknown. Those who remained after the soldiers departed tended to be the most defenseless: children, the elderly, and all those either too poor or physically weak to secure passage out of the city. Without protection, without personal resources, without a plan, all these people had was hope that the Japanese would treat them well. Many likely talked themselves into the belief that once the fighting stopped, the Japanese would of course treat them civilly. Some may have even convinced themselves that the Japanese would be better rulers. After all, their own government had clearly abandoned them in their hour of need. Weary of fire, weary of bombardment, and weary of siege, scattered groups of Chinese actually rushed out to welcome the Japanese invaders as they thundered into the city with their tanks, artillery, and trucks. Some people hung Japanese flags from their windows, while others even cheered the Japanese columns as they marched through the south and west gates of the city. Their cheers were short-lived.